Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to join you. And before addressing some of the momentous issues of these days, to pay tribute to your industry. I am indeed Lord Hague of Richmond, which is Richmond, Yorkshire, be in no doubt about that. Which is a great tourist area. It's sometimes mixed up with other Richmonds. In fact, when I was elected as the youngest Conservative MP at the age of 27, one of my opponents was Screaming Lord Such, if you remember him, who was leader of the Monster Raving Loony Party at the time. And he stood against me in the by-election, and he spent his first day campaigning in Richmond, Surrey. Until somebody tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, I think the election's in Richmond, Yorkshire." And then he came up to Richmond, Yorkshire, said this showed he really was a loony candidate. And he had a policy of bringing in a 99 pence coin so you wouldn't have to give a penny change anymore. And 300 people voted for him to be their Member of Parliament. But I represented the Yorkshire Dales over there for 26 years in the House of Commons, and I have a house in mid-Wales now and was Secretary of State for Wales. So I feel I've represented some of the finest areas and greatest tourist areas of the United Kingdom, and I visited as Foreign Secretary more countries than any Foreign Secretary in history, partly because there are more countries now than there ever were before. I went to 83 countries, and I didn't see anywhere better than the United Kingdom to visit anywhere in the world. And I'm therefore an enthusiastic supporter of your work. And whatever's just happened in the referendum, and I was on the Remain side, so I'm not too happy about what happened in the referendum, but everybody has to work with it now. And from your point of view, remember, we're not losing our landscape, we're not losing our valleys and our rivers and our heritage and our coastlines and our hills and our abbeys and our market towns and our cosmopolitan cities and our world-beating museums and our great hotels. We will still have all of those things despite leaving the European Union. And we have to make the most of them, as you no doubt are dedicated to making the most of them. There will be other things of which you can make the most. There has been one of the fastest depreciations of our currency that we've ever seen in the last few days. Well, that has benefits for your industry too when it comes to incoming business. There may be limits to how much you can benefit from it. I can't quite see you doing tours of towns that voted to leave the European Union, which might be one. These are the towns that broke Europe. People could have quite a fascinating trip around England and Wales anyway on that basis. But get ready to argue for changes in regulations that you always thought were wrong, if they were EU regulations or Britain's interpretation of those regulations. If there are taxes that could be changed in the light of withdrawing from the EU, which would benefit your industry or particularly employment in your industry. It's going to be a really important time to influence the government, the reformed government from early September, about that. Now, clearly the voters last Thursday sprang a bit of a surprise to most people. They're good at doing that. They almost do it deliberately on occasion. The voters are, you always have to respect the British voter. I went to one household in the election last year when I was just stepping down from Parliament, helping out one of my old colleagues. And on the Monday before the election, I knocked on a door and said to a lady, "Will you vote Conservative on Thursday?" And she said, "Shh." And I said, "Well, I've just come to see if you'll vote Conservative on Thursday." She said, "Be quiet, Mr. Hague." I said, "Why, is somebody sleeping?" She said, "No," she said, "my husband's in the back. He votes Labour, and I've told him it's on Friday." So this is what the voters are like, let alone the politicians. This is the scheming skullduggery of the voters. So no wonder opinion polls get the wrong result when they try and ask people. What would a pollster have found in that house when trying to work out how people were going to vote? But added to the normal unpredictability of elections is now a great deal of disillusionment running through elections, political systems all over the Western world. I saw, when I was in America a few weeks ago looking at the presidential election, I saw a bumper sticker that said, "Cheer up, only one of them can win," and which is how you might feel about a number of elections at the moment, but we have something in common with what's going on in America. You know, when Americans travel abroad now, people are saying, "Are you serious, Donald Trump? You know, that Trump with the hair, with the tower and everything, he might be the president." And Americans have to explain that could happen. But then we look at Austria in our own continent and we say, was that right that a far-right candidate nearly got elected president a few weeks ago? Not just right-wing, far right nearly won the presidential election. And they did. And then people look at us in Britain and say, have you just voted to leave the European Union in a referendum? And we have. And there are important things in common between all these situations, because politics is changing rapidly. It's changing because of social media. You know, last year when Jeremy Corbyn was elected Labour leader, with a couple of 100,000 people joining the Labour Party in 6 weeks, that could not have been coordinated in the past without social media. It couldn't have happened in that way. And indeed, what's going on today in the Labour Party, there were 3 attempted coups against Jeremy Corbyn in the last few days, all of which collided with each other. And the reason they found out about each other was social media and the gossip that results. So, in fact, so much is going on today in the Labour Party. People are resigning who most of us had never heard of being appointed in the first place. But the whole speed of politics, it's all speeded up. And at the same time, there is a decline of traditional voting habits, a decline of the old class-based voting. Voters behave more like consumers than like loyalists now. And there's anger. There is anger still after the global financial crisis of 8 years ago about what banks did, about how governments responded, about the consequences for many people and their own incomes all over the Western world after that, about rising inequality in some societies, and about rapid social change happening at the same time, including, of course, immigration. And when you add all of these things together, you get powerful political insurgencies. And these things are not going away. If these circumstances don't change, well, Donald Trump might not be elected president of the United States, but somebody like him will be in 4 or 8 years' time. These things are not going away anytime soon. And one of my fears is that hopes will now have been raised by the vote to leave the European Union. Quite a lot of promises were made, after all, by the Leave campaign, which can't now be fulfilled. Particularly commitments about reducing immigration. Many people, you might think, and I might think, they shouldn't be fulfilled. But the fact that people voted believing immigration would be greatly reduced, and then it might not be in a few years' time, will create a new cycle of political disillusionment. So we are now in a world of less stable political systems. Why was there such a close and unpredicted result? Well, it was a difficult campaign for the British political parties, of course. The Conservatives were divided. The Labour Party leadership was distinctly unenthusiastic about their own position. The Liberal Democrats have not yet recovered from being held by us in an embrace of death for 5 years, which strangled the life out of them for some time to come. The Scottish nationalists had mixed motives about their position. And on the other side was this powerful factor of people worried about population growth and what they saw as uncontrolled migration from the European Union. What happens next? Well, this will have an effect on Europe. In fact, notice that stock markets have gone down on the whole more on the continent in the last few days than they have in the UK. So this has a wider effect than in the UK. There will now be strengthened movements in some European countries for them to have referendums and leave the EU, although I don't think that will happen anytime soon. There will also be a new push to achieve tighter integration in the EU, with Britain out of it. Those who want a more closely integrated European Union no longer have Britain to worry about, Britain putting a brake on that. So I think there will be increased tension in Europe, actually, between integrationist forces that will become a bit stronger and forces pulling it apart that are also becoming stronger, a more polarized Europe that will have its own difficulties intensified by the British decision. What happens next in Britain? Well, a new Prime Minister is being selected. By September 2nd, on the timetable provisionally set today, depending on the approval of one or two other bodies. That means nominations close for our new Prime Minister on Thursday this week. So very rapid decisions have to be made about who's going to stand. You will be aware of some of the favourites. You can't ever rule out in a Conservative election a dark horse emerging. I was 66-1 against not long before I became leader of the Conservative Party. So the bookies don't necessarily get these things right. The MPs are now all furiously phoning each other and talking to each other about who they are going to support. Of course, there is a good argument for the Prime Minister to be somebody who argued for leaving, so that the future policies of the government are set by somebody who believed this was the right course of action. But there are other experienced candidates as well. And as they contend for their own party leadership in the next couple of months, they will have to start to answer questions that were not answered in the referendum campaign. Questions about what sort of relationship are we aiming for with the European Union if we're not going to be in it? Are we trying to be in the European Economic Area with Norway and Iceland? Or are we looking for a free trade agreement like Canada? Or are those things so difficult to negotiate, we're just going to rely on World Trade Organization rules? They have to start to answer the question, when will we serve notice on Europe under Article 50 of the treaties that we are leaving? And of course, some preparation is taking place now. The Prime Minister announced this afternoon, about 3 hours ago, that a new unit is being created in government to bring together the best and the brightest, as he described it, out of the Treasury, the Foreign Office, the Cabinet Office. Some of them will come out of embassies as well, to start looking at all the options on these things so that the incoming Prime Minister in September has the best possible advice. And that's really important because this is one of the messiest divorces you can imagine. This is not just a matter of walking out and slamming the door. Because imagine all the things you have to negotiate about. You're straight into who has fishing rights there or there. When do single farm payments come to an end? In which part of the country? And how do they come to an end? What about EU regional subsidies and support? At what stage do they come to an end, and are they replaced by the British government? What are the rights of British nationals living and working in the rest of the EU and of EU nationals here? How is the Northern Ireland border with the Republic of Ireland going to be operated when it's never been a hard border forever in its existence, and now will become an external EU border? And you can soon think of 1,000 questions like that. And it's not really a matter, therefore, of whether someone's going to be nasty about the negotiations. It's just they are so complex to separate Britain now from the European Union that it is bound to give rise to a huge number of difficult questions. And in the middle of all of those questions, the government has to make sure there's economic confidence for people to invest, for businesses to be able to make decisions, even though these negotiations may take many years. There is a danger, as economists have pointed out, of a short-term recession. There aren't many economists who didn't think that there would be no short-term recession, that didn't think there would be a recession following a leave vote. So business has to be ready for that and ready to argue for the advantages that it needs, for tax changes that would give it stability, for measures that would help business in general and that would attract business and investment to the UK. At the same time, of course, the new Prime Minister has to have a very sharp eye on keeping the United Kingdom together, because this vote in which Scotland voted to remain, but England and Wales voted to leave the European Union, has now set the scene for many months or years of acrimony between Edinburgh and London in how the negotiations are carried out, in how Scotland can manage to stay in the European Union without the rest of us, in the view of Scottish nationalists. The huge debate now as to whether that brings forth another referendum in Scotland. And so it's a multitude of different tasks. The new Prime Minister will be fighting on several different fronts to stabilize the economy, to conduct the withdrawal negotiations from the EU, to try and establish a new relationship with the EU and with the 58 other countries around the rest of the world with whom we have trade agreements through the EU, and at the same time try and keep the United Kingdom together when some people are trying to pull it apart. Now that is a tall order. I think it is the most difficult, the most complex set of circumstances facing an incoming Prime Minister since Churchill took office in May 1940. It's not as serious as when Churchill took office in May 1940, but it is the most complex set of circumstances since then. So the test is going to be, as the debate goes on as to who should head the government, who can do those things, who is able to tackle all of those things simultaneously. There will also, of course, be a major debate about the UK's role in the world. And in the view of many of us, it's important that that role is maintained, even outside the European Union. We are fortunate as a country to be in nearly everything. We've been in nearly every club. The European Union, NATO, the Commonwealth, the G7, the G20, the United Nations Security Council. And when you sit there as Foreign Secretary, as I did for 4 years, you use every one of those tables. You employ your links and your power and your vote in every one of those organizations to try to bring about the effect in the world that you want. Well, we're leaving one of those tables now. But that means, in a way, we have to use the others even more. The special relationship with America, the Commonwealth, and the new links with emerging economies in emerging powers around the world. We're in a world of greater volatility, of which this is an example, and I illustrated how it is an example in how politics has become more volatile. But we're in a more volatile world overall. That's partly because of the information revolution that is changing so many things. It's partly because of the rise of religious intolerance in the Middle East, which, when allied to the information revolution, gives you ISIL, able to communicate its hateful message all over the world and find recruits all over the world. That could not have happened before the information age. That volatility is also driven by rapid demographic change. The growth of population in much of the world has slowed down, but in one area it hasn't slowed down. It's not slowing down, and that's in Africa and the Middle East, if we can call that one area, where there looks set to be another 1.25 billion additional people in the next 30 years, an added population more than twice the size of the whole population of Europe today. And that is in turn increasing volatility in world affairs, producing huge migratory pressures. And on top of that, we have a more multipolar world. No one power able to force issues, to exert its power on every country in the world, with many new centers of power, such as in China, and rising tension in the Asia-Pacific region between that emerging China and other longer established nations. So we live in a more volatile world anyway, and that's not to be more pessimistic about it. After all, great breakthroughs are made all the time. I would have thought 5 years ago the country would be most likely to be at war with would be Iran. But in the last year or two, we have sealed a nuclear deal with Iran, and the danger of that has been averted. In the last few days, Colombia managed to end 50 years of conflict that has ruined that country, and that part of South America will now be able to open up economically and to visitors from all over the world. We're on the edge of remarkable scientific breakthroughs. So we should not be pessimistic about human affairs and think that the world that our world is doomed. We just have to get used to the idea there is more volatility, that on a rising trend line of what's going on in the human world, there is greater variation from year to year. And that means in businesses and in governments, we need resilience. It was more useful to me when I was Foreign Secretary to set up a crisis center that I could activate at half an hour's notice to deal with the crises nobody had ever predicted than it was to listen to all the experts about what crisis was going to happen next. And businesses and all organizations now need that flexibility, particularly to respond to and repel cyber attack, the new rapidly rising threat. So it means we need resilience, we need diversity of advice and opinion, because groupthink is all the time on display. And the way the financial markets all got it into their heads last Thursday that there was going to be one result, and then some people lost a fortune hours later because there was a different result, is another recent example of that groupthink. It means we need more local knowledge of our markets around the world, because there will be countries right next door to each other whose performance and whose future is very different from each other. And it means we need more long-term thinking, and that we hold our nerve even when we're hit by one of these bouts of volatility. And that, I think, is what we have to do now as a country and in all our industries. It's still possible to succeed, to navigate our way through these severe bouts of volatility and instability. We're about to experience one of them over the next couple of months. And I think in your industry, you have to do everything possible to make sure that government and parliament hear your needs so that you can take advantage of the opportunities as well as face the dangers of this rather dramatically changed situation in our relationships in the world. Those are my thoughts about what's happening in the world at the moment. I'll be delighted to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much indeed. So, yes.
Good evening, Lord Hay.
Good evening.
Just a question. What do you think is the likelihood of this current situation triggering a new general election and potentially Article 50 never being sent to Brussels?
Mm-hmm. I think both of those are unlikely. I think that, well, several points to make on this. First of all, we now have fixed-term parliaments. And so the date of the next general election is already set as the first week of May 2020. Now, there is a way out of that, but it involves quite a bit of acrobatics by the political parties. You'd have to have really the government and the opposition wanting to have a general election. Do they look to you like parties that are in a fit state to fight a general election? I mean, neither of them want to have a general election. They have a huge incentive not to do so. And for Conservatives, you know, you've got all those MPs, they have a narrow majority in the Commons. They're 4 years from having to have another general election. And they have this immensely difficult situation to resolve. So that's not to say it couldn't happen. Given that I've just said we're in this very unpredictable, volatile political world, I can't stand here and say, you know, on no account will there be a general election. But you can see how the incentives built into the system are not to have a general election, but to implement what people decided in the referendum. And one of the striking things in Parliament is other than in the Scottish Parliament, but in the Westminster Parliament, is the near unanimity that the will of the people must now be implemented. You can argue about whether it was a good idea to have a referendum or how it was fought, but on a high turnout of voters, higher than in any recent general election, people voted by, you know, it was narrow proportionally, but it was a near 1.5 million majority. In all parts of the country except London, Scotland and Northern Ireland, they voted to leave the European Union. And so the general mood is, well, whether we agree with that or not, we have to do it. The grey area is, what did that mean? Does it mean you can't be in the European Economic Area? Does it mean we can't have a free trade agreement. You know, that's the area that will now be debated a lot. But I don't see those questions bringing about a general election. But I might be wrong. Comes with that caveat. Who wants to ask the next question? Yes, we've got a microphone over there. Yeah.
How much do you think the House of Lords is going to have to change?
How much do I think the House of Lords is going to have to change? Oh, it should change a lot. Well, I'm now in the House of Lords, of course, and you know, its membership is pretty old. When I got there a few months ago, I ran up the stairs and got a round of applause, and they hadn't seen anything move that fast in a long time. I've always voted for an elected upper house, and I will continue to vote for that, even though I'm in it. I will happily, you know, get myself replaced by somebody elected at some point. But I don't see that in the middle of all these other changes. Britain isn't going to embark on changing its parliamentary system at the same time. I think actually in this particular situation over the next few months, the House of Lords does have an enormous number of people who've handled relations with Europe and handled our diplomatic service and served in the European Commission and so on. And it is at least a repository of a great deal of experience, which hopefully people can express over the coming months. So it's probably not going to change very much, except we're all going to age together in it, including me. So who's next? Are we coming over here? We've got a lady down at the front here, and perhaps after well, in any order. Have you got a microphone here? And then we'll go to the gentleman over there.
Hello, can you hear me?
There we go.
Susanna Rendell from Stoke-by-Newton Hotel Golf and Spa. At what point does this petition that's going around become relevant with the numbers of people that have put their names towards it? And how would that also affect the Scottish situation where they're saying that they're going to try and stop UK coming out of the EU?
You're talking about the petition to have a second referendum?
Yes.
Well, it's relevant. It shows the anger of a lot of people on the other side. There was anger on the Leave side that powered them to victory. Well, now there's quite a bit of anger on the Remain side as to the decision that has been made. And that when a petition has so many signatures, it's highly likely to be debated in Parliament. Although, of course, Parliament will be having endless debates anyway about the whole consequences of the referendum, and we'll be debating it for many years. Personally, I don't see us having a second referendum. And just as in the answer to the gentleman over there who asked about a general election, you can't rule that out. The way things happen so extraordinarily now in politics, one can't rule that out. I don't think it's really I wouldn't recommend it as the great campaign now, because I think it's unlikely to happen, and I think if it did, it would be as likely to produce, even more likely to produce the Leave result than the one we've just had. Because one of the worst things you can do in any organization or country when you've just made a huge decision is then to cast doubt on whether you've made it. I was on the Remain side. But if you ask me now people have decided to leave, the best thing to do is leave, rather than say, oh no, maybe we'll stay. Because, if many of us didn't like it, but now we have to make the best of that decision. We live in a democracy. It was made with a high turnout. It's not like this was a referendum where only a third of people voted. There was 4 months of campaigning, and the vast majority of the electorate voted. And can you go on and on asking them again? I think there would be such outrage about that, you'd just get the same answer by a bigger majority. So it illustrates the concern that people have about the result. But I don't think it will lead to a second referendum and a reversal of the outcome. So my advice is adapt now to this change and find the advantages among all the disadvantages. And try to identify those and make the most of them. Yes, I said we'd come over to the gentleman here.
Yes. Do you think it should be, could be, or is it being used as a tactic, the possible delay in enforcing the Article 50 to try and renegotiate again with the EU?
So, what, a tactic to not to leave it? You mean, or to?
Yes.
Yes. Have the microphone back. Yeah.
Well, I think as a country we've shown our intent.
Yes.
Maybe that intent wasn't sore, and now the referendum's been actioned. The meeting towards the end of this week with the EU again, do you think by us not enforcing Article 50 now and waiting to that meeting, the EU may want to renegotiate some of the points?
No, absolutely not. No, the EU are not now going to say, "Oh, sorry, we'll give you a better deal now." First of all, they would never be able to agree on that better deal. It would require 27 countries who found it very difficult even to agree what they agreed with the Prime Minister in February, to all agree on something better, and they wouldn't be able to do so. Second, if they did so, they would make their whole EU unravel. Because if the way to get a really good deal is to hold a referendum and vote to leave, well, what would happen? Other countries would follow that splendid example and do the same or threaten to do the same and so on. So, no, the overall reaction of the EU will not now be to offer something better to the UK. They will want to say, well, we want this, we'll enter into negotiations about all the sorts of things that I just talked about, fishing and farming and financial services and borders and so on, and get that over with as soon as we can. But now you've said you're going, you're going. And I think the reason why the Prime Minister, he was asked about this in Parliament this afternoon while you've been having your conference about Article 50. The reason he's not served notice now is because, and I think he's right about this, it needs a new Prime Minister who has a clear idea of what we're aiming for as we leave the EU, the new relationship that we want or don't want, to link the serving of our notice under Article 50 with that, so that as soon as you lay Article 50 on the table, it comes with Britain's expectations, negotiations. And the Prime Minister, David Cameron, doesn't feel he can do that because all of that is going to be taken forward by somebody new. And of course, there are people on the Leave side who argued strenuously that we shouldn't serve notice under Article 50 anytime soon. Because once you do that, you start a 2-year clock ticking to which the negotiations might be limited. And you don't want to use up the first 2 months of the 2 years while you're still working out what you want to do. So there is a good case for waiting until until the whole strategy is ready. But it's not a tactic to produce some new better offer of how we stay in the EU. It's definitely not that. We are going now, and there isn't any way back in. So I really do recommend to everybody, make that mental leap now. We are going. Even though some of us like me were very much against it. So, how much more time? I'm conscious shall we take a few more questions? Is that all right? Okay, well, we've got 3, I can see 4 hands up, so why don't we do those 4 and we'll stop at that. So, gentleman there's got a microphone, then here, and then 2 along the side, and we'll stop with that.
Yeah, Russell Denison, I'm going to call you William because it's not so long ago since we were at university together. Do you see any chance at all that the result of this referendum might actually lead to the looser federation, if I can use that word, amongst the European states, the kind of trading bloc that the British have always wanted rather than the federalist, ever closer union?
I don't think so. I think, if anything, it pushes Europe slightly the other way. Because the strongest counterweight against political union in Europe is now going. And so, the French government, for example, that believes in closer political union in Europe, partly because they're having immense difficulty governing their own country. The French government sees this as an opportunity to press now for the closer centralized integration of the European Union. And as I mentioned in my remarks earlier, there will now be forces pulling in both directions, but it's not going to lead them to say, oh, we're now just going to be a trading bloc like the European Economic Community. They formed the euro. And without Britain in the EU, the Eurozone really is the dominant, is really in a position to dictate to the whole of the rest of the EU whether or not they're in the Eurozone. And so they're not going to reverse that unless economic circumstances force them to do so. And we're a long way from that, I think. Yes, so I said we'd come to the gentleman here and then two along the side there, and then we'll let you all have your drinks or whatever you do next.
Good evening, Lord Hague. A couple of very quick questions for you. Would you have done a David Cameron? Would you have resigned immediately after, given the fact that you both were in the Remain camp? And the second question is, have you had a call from the Prime Minister yet and invited you to be part of this expert team that's going to help unravel all this?
First of all, I absolutely would have done I have a good track record in resigning, actually. I'm an expert at it. And no, I would, because it's always an upsetting thing to do. But if people have voted the other way, we are a democracy, and you have to recognize that. And, you know, if he hadn't done that, it was a bit of a surprise to some people, but it wasn't a surprise to me, because imagine his situation if he'd said, no, I'm going to carry on as Prime Minister. Well, then every day would have been asked, how can you carry on when people just rejected your advice on a matter of central, generational importance? And, you know, then he would have been expected to himself put forward the whole plan for leaving the European Union, in which he did not believe. Well, can you run a country on that basis? The track record of governments successfully pursuing something which the head of government doesn't believe in is not good. No, he was in an untenable position, I think, once the referendum result came out. And he is a very rational, well-balanced person. He is the sanest person who's been Prime Minister in my time in politics. He recognized that. Has he asked me? No, I have retired from government. That's why I'm here speaking to you frankly about government. And I had 26 years in the House of Commons. I was the Foreign Secretary. I was the leader of the party. I did 20 years really in the front line of politics. And there comes a point where you've had enough of it. And so now I give I still show up at the House of Lords, and I give my advice to the nation and the government in a weekly column in the Daily Telegraph, which comes out tomorrow. It will be available on good newsstands tomorrow morning. And I'm having a great time in every way, and I'm absolutely not going back into government. There are lots of new talents on the way up. This is the moment they're going to have to prove themselves. Yes, we've got two questions on the side, and then we're going to stop.
Yes. Thank you, Lord Hague. I must say, if we'd heard, or if the population had heard some of your comments in your speech to us, maybe we would have had a different result, actually. Can I ask you, how do we retrieve our reputation and retain our influence in the world? This is very important, especially the reputation to the tourism industry in the United Kingdom.
It's really important. Yes, I think that's an absolutely crucial point for the country and many of its businesses, but clearly, particularly in your industry, the reputation of the country is of vital importance. And I think that, well, it will depend, of course, largely on how successfully we handle all those issues I just identified. You know, keeping the UK together, stabilizing economic confidence, having a clear negotiating strategy and then pursuing that in a fair-minded way. This will all help the reputation of our country, but I think showing that we are still highly active internationally in all those other organizations I listed, you know, that this doesn't mean, at least I hope it doesn't mean, that we're turning our backs on the world. We will remain a nation that votes wisely at the UN Security Council, that plays a big role in NATO, that has one of the biggest development budgets in the world, that sends humanitarian assistance whenever people need it, that continues to have, as I mentioned earlier, these great cosmopolitan cities. We have come at or near the top in recent years of league tables of soft power. They're subjective things, but people do these league tables of which country has the most soft power in the world. And usually we come second after the United States. Sometimes, particularly since the Olympics, we even come first. Well, we have to make sure we hang on to all of that, because actually most of that depends on our language, our law, our fairness, our openness, our international contribution, our culture and history, rather than on our membership of the European Union. So we ought to be able to maintain our values in the world. If we don't, well, that really would be an even bigger mistake. So I think that's partly what the politics of the next few years is about, making sure that despite this, we maintain those values in the world. Our reputation rests on that. Right, thank you. Final question then. Yes, sir.
Andy Kemp, Bidvest Food Service. 40 years on, knowing what you know and with your foreign knowledge, would you have ever gone in the EU to begin with?
Well, knowing that we were going to pull out in the end. Yes, I would have gone in the, not knowing this last bit, perhaps, because there's a lot wrong with it, and I've been one of its biggest critics. I led the opposition in this country in the 1990s to joining the euro, and few people have said as damning things about the EU as I have. I said the euro would become a burning building with no exits, and I was condemned for these inflammatory remarks, but it is for the people of Greece now. That is what it has become. So I'm no great fan of EU institutions and ideas, but I do think it's right for Britain to have joined it. The right position through history for Britain is to be engaged in European affairs, but not dominated by any one other European nation. And in the last few decades, that has taken the form of being in the European Union and doing our best inside it. So I think that's been true to our best traditions. And amidst all its faults, it has achieved one thing unambiguously, which is it has provided stability and common democratic aspirations for countries after the Cold War, and indeed originally recovering from the Second World War. And it has anchored Europe together in a framework of cooperation, which it could have done with for many centuries before. So I think, bearing all those things in mind, it has been right for Britain to try in the European Union. But clearly it's not worked out for us in the view of 51.9% of the population. So now we try something different. But yes, my frank answer to your question is I would have gone in the first place. And but the people have decided, and now we're leaving. And I'm leaving too. So thank you very much indeed.